Karl and Donald, a play by John Anderson. This is a play about the meeting between Karl Marx, the famous German philosopher, economist, and activist, who was born in 1818 and died in 1883 in London, and Donald Smith, Baron Strathcona and Mount Royal, who was born in 1820, also died in London in 1914. Both are buried opposite each other in the Highgate Cemetery in North London. Both have substantial tombs and monuments facing each other. The play starts from the premise that it is today, or in the 2020s, and that late at night, before the dawn, the ghosts of Marx and Smith often meet each other by their graves when no one else is around and discuss not only their respective pasts, one a champion of socialism, the other of capitalism, but also comment on history since their deaths. While many may have heard of Karl Marx and his role as author of many works such as the Communist Manifesto and Capital, as well as being one of the founders of the International Workingmen's International, the first international of socialist parties, many may not have heard of Donald Smith. And yet in many Canadian cities and towns, there is a Strathcona street, neighborhood, or school. Donald Smith died certainly one of the wealthiest Canadians ever. He was for many years the High Commissioner to the UK and Chancellor of McGill University, as well as chair of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became BP. Smith also helped found the Canadian Pacific Railway and was photographed when he drove in the last spike. He was president of the Bank of Montreal and the Hudson's Bay Company. All this started after, as a 17-year-old Scottish-born immigrant, he spent years in Labrador running Hudson's Bay posts in the fur trade. The play tries to contrast their different background and ideas. So, it's 4 a.m. on Monday morning, and still dark in Highgate Cemetery in London. The mist and fog are circulating around the blasted heath. The grave of Karl Marx is situated opposite that of Donald Smith. So here, it's Karl here. What are you doing up at this hour?
I wanted to find out how my investments were doing.
You're dead. You don't have any more investments.
Well, but my companies are still doing very well. Look at Anglo-Persian, which they now call British Petroleum. Look at Hudson Bay, still going strong. Well, maybe not so strong, but still there. And finally, look at Canadian Pacific. We lost the hotels, the airline, and the steamships, but now we're merging with Kansas City Southern, and we will be one of the biggest railways again. Certainly doing better than your projects.
Well, some things may be turning out not what I thought would happen, but China is still a communist country, at least in name, and will become the world's greatest economic power. And in the USA, more young people like socialism and Bernie Sanders than ever before.
Well, my success and my many companies' successes are only there because they are copying the lessons that I learned as a young boy working for the Hudson Bay Company in the north of Canada. I understand that you never had a job as a young person.
Yes, but there were not so many jobs open to young Jews in Germany at the time. Sure, my father had converted to Christianity to survive, but nobody really believed he was no longer a Jew.
Well, being a Scot with a strong accent was not always great in Canada, where the family compact and the Shadow Clique in Lower Canada, as the power groups around the English governors were called, ran the whole show.
Well, tell me how that worked out. I knew the East India Company better than the Hudson's Bay Company, but actually the HBC ruled over an area much larger than the East India Company. You ruled over really most of what is now Canada. But Donald, if I may call you that instead of Baron Strathcona Mount Royal, as I understand your family got you the job in Canada, even though you were a kid, because of your uncle who had been the chief factor of the HBC, as they called the CEO. So getting a job in Canada or Labrador where you first went was not your doing.
Well, sure, I had an Uncle John Stewart who was an explorer and got me a job. I was 17 when I arrived near Tadoussac. I spent 12 years in Labrador trading furs and buying salmon, while you were a man only 2 years older than me, and you were drinking and dueling at Bonn and later in Berlin. I never got a chance to get higher education, but still later became Chancellor of McGill University. You probably never heard of it, but it became one of the world's great universities, so they say. And your family background was also pretty bourgeois. Didn't your mother's family end up founding Philips Electronics? You know, the big Dutch multinational, which has flooded the world with all kinds of disposable electronics?
Okay, but I married a non-Jew, and that was pretty rad for the times, as I remember.
Well, my wife, Margaret, was part native, and she had been married before and not formally divorced. So I got into a lot of trouble because of all that, which was just the way of the fur traders in those days.
Well, I know all about that, but all those in-laws were quite useful later on because they, along with my friend Friedrich Engels, was how I survived. What's wrong with getting handouts from rich friends? I mean, Freddie was also a decent writer, and after I died, he really saved my books such as Capital.
Yeah, so all your project work would have been impossible without the capitalist system working efficiently and producing profit.
But as you say, you got the job in Labrador because of your relative, John Stewart, who was, as you call him, an explorer as well as an entrepreneur. He was the partner of Simon Fraser, who was one of those people who got everything named after him, such as a river and a university, just because he was the first white man to canoe down that route. Then you had your cousin, George Stephen, who helped you out get into the job, get into the Bank of Montreal and become the president. But more important was the fact that you then went on with Stephen, later Baron Mount Stephen, to found the Canadian Pacific Railway.
Okay, well, he was my cousin, but he had a different background than me. He never spent any time in Labrador. He was a goddamn milliner, but he was good at three things: raising money, lots of money, bribing the government to get the CPR approved, and then salmon fishing. He opened up salmon fishing in the Gaspé and founded the Rufford Gardens. He also gave millions like me to found the Royal Victoria Hospital. And by the way, after all those years, instead of fixing the Vic, they decided to abandon it and build a new hospital in NDG, of all places. NDG, no damn good. That's what it really stands for. Imagine abandoning a hospital located in the Golden Square Mile and moving it to some hideous suburb.
But you, Donald, what happened to your mansion on Dorchester Street?
Yeah, that was a loss. Gone now. It was a magnificent house.
But what is worse for you is that Dorchester is gone now, too.
What do you mean?
The street is now called René Lévesque Boulevard.
You mean they named her it after that separatist prick?
You are funny, Donny. You're all upset with Quebec wanting to separate when your country of origin, Scotland, is now ruled by a separatist party, the Scottish Nationalist Party, which wants to separate. You Brits, but especially you Canadians, do not like to use the term imperialism, but that was what you did to secure Canada. In fact, looking at it again, it was imperial domination by the oldest continually existing capitalist company in the world, the Bay. What a great plan, Donny, if I may call you that. Doesn't a once and future US president who also has a Scottish mother also have the Donald name? You just shipped in trade, trinkets, guns, and knives and booze for furs, which sold for a fortune in Europe. And also, you didn't sign any treaties, but just take over the land, calling it Rupert's Land, after the most reactionary brother of Charles the First, the king who lost his head in the English Civil War, or rather the first bourgeois revolution, as I like to call it. By the way, amazing that the almost sainted Queen Elizabeth, who died recently, named her eldest son Charles, knowing full well that if and when he became king, he would revive the Charles, or as I prefer, Chuck name, and Charles I was not only one of the most reactionary kings, he was the only king to lose his head.
Well, the HBC always gave Native people good products, and we were moving them along on the path of civilization. In fact, when you look at what happened to Indigenous people in the USA, that massacre at Wounded Knee, the mass forced migration to Oklahoma, and the brutal shootings of so many, Canada actually did much better.
Hold on, not very much better. What about the so-called Riel rebellions? The residential school system where thousands of kids died as they were being stripped of their identity in boarding schools run by vicious priests and nuns and civil servants. What about the poverty rate today for Indigenous people? 44% on reserve in poverty. So much for the fur trade. No, you only had a better way of stealing land through the bay, selling muskets and trinkets for furs, than selling the whole, or rather 90% of the land. Then you sold that land to the Canadian state. So your HBC was a trick and a ruse and a model of how to expropriate native lands without putting the gun in the first place. But of course, you still had the gun, and the British and then the Canadian Army and the RCMP in the process.
Well, talking about ruses, didn't your father renounce his name and his religion and move to becoming Heinrich from Herschel and a Christian from a rabbi's son?
Well, that was not his choice. He had to do that to survive in the Germany of those years. In fact, look what happened to Germany's Jewry in the 20th century. And German Jews were the most integrated Jewish group in the world at the time, with Einstein, Mendelssohn, Mahler, and socialists such as on the right, Bernstein, and on the left, Rosa Luxemburg.
Well, Scots have always had to hide their accent, their Christian Presbyterian sect, and the fact that we are generally smarter than the English. We got forced out of the Highlands by many English landlords. Did you know half of the country's rural land is owned by only 432 landowners? A picture that's remained largely unchanged in recent decades, and many of them are foreigners.
Weren't you one of them?
Well, yes, but that was later on. Okay, we saw that Canada was a place where the Scots could run the show, found a new country, and then run the political system, the banking system, and the economy. Even before Canada became a country in 1867, it was Scottish-born William Lyon Mackenzie that was the leader of one of the rebellions in 1837 in Upper Canada, which set the stage for the creation of Canada as a country. And did you know the first two prime ministers, John A. Macdonald and Alexander Mackenzie, were both born in Scotland?
But aren't crowds knocking down McDonald's statue all across Canada? Or moving into a back room? Because the founding fathers said terrible things about Native people or Indigenous, as they want to be called. He set up the residential school system to assimilate and eliminate Indigenous kids, and while doing so, made sure that thousands died in the process. Didn't he say, and this is a quote, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would put them in central training industrial schools where they were acquired the habits and modes of thought of white man." So what, if anything, was good about John A.?
Well, because of their Scottish heritage, John A. and Alexander M. understood how different nationalities could be suppressed by the English, as were the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh in the British so-called United Kingdom. That's why they gave the French in Quebec language rights, religious rights, and autonomy in the province, the Napoleonic Code, and even some rights in federal institutions such as the Supreme Court. Without John and Alex, we would have probably had total assimilation of Quebec, the US way that they did to the French in New England and Louisiana.
Well, I know you gave lots of money to the Royal Victoria Hospital and McGill University, but I don't remember you giving any to French Canadian hospitals or universities.
Well, but didn't Laurier go to McGill?
You know, Donald, what really amazes me is how I once said, or rather, Engels and I once wrote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, or the business class. Well, you seem to embody both state and bourgeoisie in one man. Like the fact that while head of the HBC and other companies, you were a member of the Manitoba legislature and then the federal parliament for Manitoba and later MP for Montreal. And to top it all off, when you paid for a whole cavalry regiment called Lord Strathcona's Horse and sent it to the Boer War, wasn't that excess upon excess?
Well, things worked out financially for me in those days, and I was able to send over 599 horses and 537 men, many of them from Western Canada.
And you shipped them from Halifax to South Africa? And didn't 160 horses die on the voyage?
Well, that's true, but my regiment won all kinds of medals and helped to keep South Africa British.
But didn't you Brits start the first concentration camps ever there and lock up women and children in unbearable conditions? Didn't 26,000 die in these camps, which were set up for Boer whites and another set of camps for their black servants?
Well, but this was all set up by our brilliant general, Lord Kitchener, the Kitchener who really helped win that war.
Didn't you change the name of the Canadian city in Ontario from Berlin to Kitchener after that monster?
Well, I wasn't in Canada anymore when that happened after the Great War. This was just a move to de-Germanize a city name.
You mean just like your pals, the Windsors, who dropped their real name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha in 1917 during the First World War. You know, Don, if I can call you that, I heard that your really secret way to conquer half of North America was through alcohol. You sold alcohol to native people for furs and got them addicted. No wonder alcoholism is still a serious issue, with 36% of indigenous people are now heavy drinkers compared to only 21% of non-indigenous people. What a cruel way to push the booze and at the same time cause so much trauma that more native people drank to forget the residential schools and the missing and murdered young women.
Well, we tried to produce high quality HBC whiskey and other products. And in the end, fewer and fewer people wanted furs anymore. It was a combination of textile machine production of clothing and the rise of coal and oil for heating houses. I even started textile production in Sherbrooke called Patent Textiles. That's why I finally switched away from furs to oil and Anglo-Persian, my company, of which I became the president. And also, as you know, in 1871, I made sure Manitoba got into Canada and that Riel was not arrested or hanged.
Okay, but that only lasted for another 15 years. And Anglo-Persian, what a colonial name. You're saying with it, we Brits will take the oil from Persia, let everybody know it is us who is screwing them. I like how after you were dead, they changed the name to British Petroleum to hide the colonial past.
Well, you call it screwing. I call it reading the tea leaves of the economic future. You know who paid for my oil? Do you know?
Well, like most capitalists, you probably got the government to write you a big check for some reason.
Well, if you really want to know, my friend and sometime liberal and later conservative.
Just like you in reverse.
So, you've heard of Winston. You see, when Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, I convinced him that oil was the future for the British Navy and that coal was a thing of the past. I even convinced him and the Admiralty to convince the House of Commons to authorize the government purchase of a 51% share in the profits of oil produced by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for the Royal Navy.
Now that is a public-private partnership, when the government buys the shares to get the profits and secure the oil for the Navy.
Winston Churchill was my man. Both us and the USA switched to oil from coal, but Germany didn't, and this was one of the main reasons for their naval defeats.
You know, Donald, your legend goes around talking about how you drove in the last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway and how you cleared out all the Chinese railway workers from the photo shoot. But you weren't even the president of the CPR.
You know, my cousin George Stephen and I were the real founders of the CPR in spite of all the corruption.
Yeah, you put in the last spike in 1885, but the real people who put in the spikes were Chinese laborers who had no rights and whom you tried to ship out as soon as the railway was built.
Well, that wasn't me. This guy Overdonk recruited the workers, first in the US and then in China. The US Chinese were experienced, but he didn't have enough of them. So in the end, had to go to China, bring in some 17,000.
It's estimated that more than 4,000 Chinese workers died during the building of the CPR, more than four for every mile of track from 1881 to 1884. I heard that in 1891, a Chinese community association collected over 300 unidentified bodies to be flown back to China for proper burial. But your friends didn't stop there. You brought in the Chinese head tax of 1885, legislated after the government no longer needed Chinese labor. It was the beginning of several discriminating legal measures enacted against the Chinese over the next 38 years. What this meant was that the Chinese males could not get partners unless they paid the head tax to bring in a new partner. You know, facing us each other means we've also got to talk a lot about world history. Because after being one of the real creators of Canadian imperialism with the HBC, you became one of the creators of Middle East imperialism. After all, it was your Anglo-Persian, which was a creation of Burma oil, which brought concession in Iran, and then in the Ottoman Empire, you really started the whole Middle East perpetual crisis built on oil and oil.
So that was the right thing. Get out of furs and onto oil.
But do you realize from the creation of Israel, the wars against Egypt, the Iraq and Syrian wars, Western powers have created a bloody mess in the Middle East, and you and your oil started it and continue it even today?
Well, just remember what country was the first to recognize Israel.
Not that old Stalin thing. Sure, Stalin's not who I wanted to be leading in socialism, but let's not forget, if the USSR was the first country to recognize Israel, it was also, in spite of Stalin, the first responsible with 20 million deaths for defeating Hitler.
Well, I know that you were a big university guy and hung out at Berlin University with Hegel and the boys. Well, I don't think you know that I never went to university, but I was a big builder of several.
Okay, so you gave to McGill, Manchester, Aberdeen, and Yale.
Well, let's stop at McGill. By the way, I also funded the Royal Victoria Hospital, which for years was the hospital in Montreal and was attached to McGill University and its medical school. But number one on my list was funding the Royal Victoria College. I gave $120,000 there in 1884 to allow women to attend classes. I said that the money was there on condition that the standard of education for women should be the same as it was for men for the ordinary degrees in arts, and that the degrees to be granted to women should be those of BA, MA, LLD, which should be granted to them by McGill University on the same conditions as to men.
But you had to make them attend in separate classrooms at first. And wasn't it strange that these first students were known for decades as Donaldas?
Well, I didn't ask for that, and I also funded the creation of the Royal Victoria College Residential School for Women in 1884, and I was the chancellor of the university from 1888 to 1914 until I died.
I know you like Vicky, as you named everything in Montreal after her. Royal Vicky Hospital, Royal Vicky College, Royal Vicky Day, even. And even stranger was your relationship with King Eddie. Edward VII, I mean. I know you were at the height of your everything in the one decade when he was the king, the so-called Edwardian era. But Jesus, if I can use that Jew's name in vain, Edward called you Uncle Donald. That was sort of a switch around, as it showed who had the real power, not the monarch, but one of the richest men in the empire. By the way, I was never a fan of so-called university administration. You can imagine who appointed the head of Prussian universities if it was not the emperor. But your quarter century at McGill was really a kick in the pants to any idea of university openness to community or students. What is happening now with the Quebec government and tuition fees is only at least partially a result of 2 centuries of McGill exclusion from the Francophone majority.
I never had any problem with the French in Quebec, as I was always aware of minority issues. But didn't you write a long letter on Confederation to your buddy Freddie, as you call him, where you said basically it was all bullshit? You said that when the colonies of British North America had confederated into a new country, the bourgeoisie of Britain will rejoice to see their investments in the watered railway stock of the provinces consolidated and guaranteed by the power of the state to tax its new citizens. Huzzah, hang out the bunting.
So at least you said huzzah, and you realized our railway projects were what made Canada. The one thing I really thought was profound in all your Marxist bullshit, if I can use that term, was when you said, it is all proof, as we noted many years ago, that the more the original isolation of separate nationalities is destroyed by the development mode of production and intercourse found and the division of labor between various nations naturally brought forth by these, the more history becomes world history. Even Canada, Voltaire's quelques arpents de neige, a few acres of snow, is now dragged onto the world stage. That was good, wasn't it? And prescient for the time. Who knew that the Confederation would lead to little Canada, population 3.4 million, now being 40 million, and in the G7? And all the time you remained High Commissioner from Canada or Ambassador to the UK through conservative and liberal rule in Canada until you died.
But then you went overboard when you wrote, what's amusing is how these so-called fathers of Confederation have followed precisely the path of historical development that we sketched in our Communist Manifesto nearly 20 years previous. I mean, come on, Chuck, if I can pay you back with the Karl diminutive, saying nonetheless, it is as if these mountebank stock jobbers and their political functionaries took our little pamphlet as a mechanic's handbook for capitalists. So well did we outline the laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production.
What I wrote was, as we said there, so has it unfolded in Canada. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. This new state claims to represent all equally, but of course, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
Well, I did like how you answered your own question. So, what does this Canadian bourgeoisie require from the state it has conquered? You answered political centralization, independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The other prescient thing you wrote was when you predicted Little Canada, then 4 provinces, would expand right across the continent. Not bad for 1867.
You mean when I wrote, this centralization will, of course, give the capitalists the organized state power they require to expand across the entire territory of British North America. We will doubtless see in Canada the same process of primitive accumulation we have seen whenever the capitalist mode of production exists.
Well, that all happened by 1949 when Newfoundland entered.
But I bet you didn't like when I wrote in my book Capital, which was just about to come out in 1867 when I wrote that letter. In Capital, I wrote conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force, play the greatest part. In America, the extirpation, enslavement, entombment in minds of the indigenous population, the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. This history, the history of their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind, in letters of blood and fire.
Well, we didn't do it with so much blood and fire in Canada.
Well, you, as we said, were just more capitalist riff-off kings with the blood and violence in the real rebellions, and then blood under the carpet with the residential school system and using the prison system to oppress them. Indigenous people represent 40% of the women and 32% of the men in the prison system in Canada. And you did not like my joke about the self-styled fathers of Confederation. Presumably, the mother is Queen Victoria. And I said this, proving your assertion that the bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production, and so bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common. You know, I like that Italian guy, Gramsci, because what he said about the fathers is similar to what I wrote about the fathers. This is what he said. He said, so too have these politicians deluded themselves, more to the point simply prove once again that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force.
I think you're right when you say, what then does the new state represent? Merely that the fetters of feudalism were burst asunder, and into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class.
I like when I wrote, for Canada, the reality behind the mask of Parliament is that modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalists. Capital has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its wage laborers. Of course, owing to the extensive use of machinery in the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workers. They become an appendage of the machine.
I hear they have this new thing now called artificial intelligence. And it may mean we don't need too many workers as appendages because so many jobs will be done by machines. This new Smith, Elon Musk, says nobody may need to work anymore.
Such will be the fate of Canadian workers. The modern laborer, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper into the conditions of existence. The very land itself will likewise follow the paths established by capital elsewhere. Spurred by competition, Canadian capital, like capital everywhere, will hardly realize that an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together, are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations. Time will tell how quickly these Canadian workers will learn the lessons they need to learn. For all their fine democracy, the workers of Canada, male white workers that is, have only the right to decide once in 3 to 6 years which member of the ruling class will misrepresent the people in Parliament. Say, that's not half bad. I may be able to use that somewhere else. But just as capital develops, so too does the proletariat and struggles. From a contest carried on by individual laborers, then by the working people of a factory, then by the operators of one trade, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels strength more.
But your only suggestion was perhaps the Canadians will build on the lessons of British workers and win a shorter working day.
As I have recently noted, one nation can and should learn from others so it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. Of course, I said the real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. Then they may raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class and wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie. So we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. I admit this has taken longer than we predicted. Ah, youth.